Shalom. Good to see you all. I know many of you, but I don't know all of you. My name is David. I'm one of the meditators out here in Maine on the East Coast. And it's really nice to be with you all today. So, a couple months ago, Bob had asked if I would share some teachings on the idea of the seasons and the cycles, the rhythms of creation. And I'm really grateful to be able to share with you a little lesson, a little teaching today on the idea of springtime. So, I want to talk a little bit about spring and the month of Shavat. And I recognize the irony in me talking about springtime, especially on a day like today, in which here in Maine we're getting many, many inches of snow, and it sounds like where many others of you are, there's been some snowfall too. So the irony is not lost on me that we're talking about springtime on really a snowy, wintry day for many of us. Uh, if you're like me, and if you live in a cold climate, you may have asked yourself this question: Is spring ever going to come? And is winter ever going to end? I think it's a question that I ask myself every year, especially in sort of like the depths of winter, where, February often, right? It's cold, it's dark, it's very snowy often, and it feels like this is really the depths of winter, and it's a question of is there ever going to be an end? And at a certain point, of course, we do recognize that the season has changed. We've entered into a new season. Frequently, though, I think we experience time and cycles more on, on a spectrum, sort of more on a continuum. We have dates by which we mark the beginning and the end of various seasons. We have our equinoxes, we have dates on our calendars where we say this is the beginning of this season and the end of that season, but that's not typically how we experience time. I think for most of us, we really recognize that time is really, and not just time, but so much of our lives are existing on this continuum where it's one experience fading into another. There's this transition where really there's like a melting away from one experience to the next experience. Time is very much like that. And often we don't know that we've been through a transition until well after that transition is concluded. So thinking about even just our daily lives, day will melt away into night, the sun sets, and it doesn't immediately feel like nighttime. It's often only a few hours later when I recognize that it's been dark for a while that I say, oh, wow, okay, night is actually here. And it's like that, of course, with the seasons, where it's not that as soon as there's the spring equinox, I know that it's springtime. It's really once the crocuses start emerging from the ground and there's that warmer day that I recognize spring is here. And so many of our other life experiences are like this as well. We have life events, we have life cycle events, major milestones, births, deaths, birthdays, marriages, things like that. But for the most part, we experience life again on this sort of continuous spectrum. And it's often only after we go through a period of darkness or challenge and struggle, maybe months or years later, that we recognize that we were in that period and we're not in that period anymore. That's really how we experience time, is on this sort of continuum, this spectrum. But it does become important sometimes to put a definitive start and stop time to a season, or a period of time in our lives. Sometimes, we need to have these definite dates on our calendars by which we can sort of measure our life and measure our experiences. So spring, and like so many other seasons, we've got these definite start and stop times. And that was especially the case in the time of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, where there was the need to establish certain times, certain start and stop times, for the purpose of tithing and bringing offerings to the temple. The Torah gives a number of laws and rules related to bringing offerings to the temple, whether they are fruits or they are animals. And it has to do often with the age of the animal or the age of the tree that is producing the fruit. And, you're not supposed to give any fruit that's from a tree or you're not supposed to consume fruit from a tree that's under 3 years old. And so there is question of, well, how do we measure the lifespan of a tree? When do we say this tree has reached 1 year in age, and when can we begin eating from this tree? When do we tithe from this tree? And so the sages of the Mishnah established a few different new years, a few different dates by which time was measured. One of them was Tu B'Shvat, which many of us are perhaps familiar with. The 15th of the month of Shvat, which is the month we're in right now. The 15th of Shvat was just this past Thursday. And this New Year of the Trees is really the date by which the lifespan of a tree is measured. And it is also considered to be the beginning of the transition into springtime. Spring usually is considered the month of Nisan, but this is the beginning of the transition into springtime. And again, it's sort of ironic. There's a paradox here that we say this is the beginning of the transition to springtime, and yet it's very cold and dark, and it feels like very much winter is still here. That was a question that the sages of the Talmud had as well. And they asked, why is it that this date, Tu B'Shvat, is the start of springtime when so much of winter is yet to happen? They even go so far as to say that the majority of winter is yet to happen. And yet they say this is the beginning of the springtime. And they answer that question by saying it's true that so much of winter remains, but it's by this date that most of the winter rain has already arrived. Most of the rain has already fallen and nourished the earth. And it's this, I think, is sort of the key point. We recognize that we don't always see the way that the environment, our surroundings, our experiences, our lives are being nourished. We don't always recognize the way that we are experiencing that proverbial rainfall, that nourishment. And yet there has to be a recognition that this is the time at which, okay, we can say this has already been happening. These rains have fallen. They've been nourishing the earth. There's been stuff happening behind the scenes that we're not aware of. And we have to just recognize that that's something that's already happened. There is the idea of Adin Steinsaltz uses this language about the divine plenty, this idea that there is this we can call it pure consciousness, we can call it God, we can call it whatever we want to call it. This idea that there is some sort of divine plenty, there is some sort of underlying substrate to all of reality that nourishes all of reality, all of creation. And it's there, and we don't necessarily recognize it on a day-to-day basis, but it's upon that all of the creation is built, and it nourishes all of existence. The other reason that's given as to why Tu B'Shvat is the beginning of the transition to spring is because this is the time of year that the sap begins to flow in the trees. And there's this idea in Kabbalism, the mystics will talk about Shefa, this idea of the divine flow. And this basically says that that divine plenty that undergirds all of reality, it nourishes all of creation, and there's a flow. There's this sort of divine flow that is sent out throughout all of creation, and it nourishes and nurtures all of us and all of reality surrounding us. This idea of the divine flow of the sap that is flowing up from the roots, entering into the trunks of trees, and is going into the branches, awakening, re-enlivening, sort of bringing these trees back to life. This idea of this flow is something that we experience in our own lives as well. The Maharal, who was a rabbi in Prague in the 16th century, he had this analogy, and he said, man is like a tree. But he said, man is like an inverted tree, an upside down tree, whose roots are in the heavens and whose branches are here on earth. And the idea is that we are all rooted in Ein Sof, in perhaps Atzilut. We have our roots in pure consciousness, and we are the channel by which that consciousness, that divine flow, that Shefa enters into this world. We are the trunk, the tree by which all of this good energy, all of this divine energy can enter into this world and nourish all of creation. This idea of shefa and of flow is so important for the springtime, these spring months. And we see that emphasized in the various holidays that we have during this period of time. Shefa flow is also connected to the idea of wine and, imbibing good wine, nourishing wine, and this idea of flowing wine. So I mentioned Tu B'Shvat was this past the 15th of the month of Shvat. It was the full moon of the month of Shvat. And there's a tradition that the Kabbalists have where they would have a Seder modeled after the Passover Seder, where they would eat all sorts of fruits, but they would drink 4 cups of wine. And so we see this idea of wine as nourishment, as flow is really front and center. The next full moon is the full moon of the month of Adar, which is Purim. And many of us are familiar with the holiday Purim, where there's a tradition among many to drink a lot of wine and to get a little tipsy. And so again, this idea of flow is there. And then the following full moon is the full moon of the month of Nisan, which is Passover, Pesach. And that is a date that, of course, the Seder is well known for having its 4 cups of wine. So also sorry to be the one to break the news that Passover is just 2 months away. But this is the idea of flow and this sort of divine shefa being front and center in the time of spring. And it's all connected to this idea of the nourishment coming up from the ground or coming up from the heavens, as we say. So I think that these are ideas that are really applicable to our own lives. And I want to just share a, uh, a quote from the Song of Songs. This is Song of Songs, chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. And I'll read it in Hebrew and then in English. So in Hebrew, Ki hine, for behold, hastav avar, the winter has passed. Hageshem chalaf halach lo, the rains are over and have gone. Hanitzadim nir'u ba'aretz, the blossoms have appeared on the land. Et hazamir higia, the time of singing has arrived. V'kol hator nishma ba'artzenu, the song, the voice of the dove is heard in our land. It's a quote that perhaps many of us are familiar with, have maybe heard before. This idea that the winter is gone, the rains have left. It is the time of singing on the land. There's a midrash on the book of Exodus that talks about this verse. The Exodus story is said to take place in the month of spring, and the word in Hebrew is just aviv, which means spring. And so it's connected with this time of year. And there's this conversation that's imagined between Moses and God. And Moses says, God is telling Moses that it's time to take the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. And Moses says, how can it be time? You told us that we were going to be stuck in the land of Egypt for 400 years. And it's only been 270 years, whatever the sages of the Midrash decided, they calculated. And so in their imagination, Moses is arguing with God and saying, it's not time yet. We have more time to go before we're supposed to leave. And in their imagination, God responds by quoting this verse. And he says, the winter is over. The rains are over and gone. The blossoms have appeared on the land. It's God telling Moses, actually, the winter has already been completed. The time of your captivity, the time of your exile in Egypt, it's actually over. You may not be able to perceive it, you may not be able to recognize it, but in reality, it's time. And you need to come to this realization. You need to actually realize it in your own bodies and your own experience that this is the time to go. For so many of us, I think there's just needs to be, we need to just recognize that there is this divine plenty that undergirds all of our experience. There is this pure consciousness that we experience, we touch at various points. There is nourishment that has been flowing and has been feeding us, even if we don't recognize it. And it's in these moments that we just have to make this realization. We need to decide that we are recognizing this, that we are realizing that we have this connection with the divine. We have this connection with this higher consciousness. And we need only open ourselves to be channels and conduits of that shefa, that flow into this world. We don't always see the whole picture. We don't always make ourselves aware of the whole picture, which is why when we meditate, when we empty ourselves, we are surrendering to this pure consciousness. We're surrendering to this nourishment, this divine plenty that we have access to. It's already there. We're touching it. We just need to open our eyes. We just need to open our bodies to be the channel by which that divine plenty can now flow into this world. So, in these coming days and weeks and months, as we journey through springtime, as the snow does melt, as the flowers begin to bloom and the trees begin to have leaves again, it's my hope and prayer that we'll have this kavanah, this intention within our own lives, in our meditations and in our daily lives, that we'll be open to that divine plenty, to that source of sustenance, and we'll be the channels by which this shefa can flow into the world. We will be the channels by which all is this light and nourishment can fill the creation, and we will be the tree that we have discussed, that we will be the the tree connected with the cosmic tree of life, bringing life, revelation, and light into this world. So that's just what I wanted to share with you. I appreciate your time. Shalom.